Hello everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm going to talk about a system we call ATTEST, which stands for pre-inference context certification layer for trustworthy multi-agent clinical decision support. That's a mouthful. So let me give you a one line that captures the whole idea. And it is on the slide. Guard the input, not just the output. Over the next 20 minutes, I will motivate why that matters, walk through how the mechanism works, and show you the benchmark evidence behind it. Here is the shape of the talk. I will spend the first part of the problem, why autonomous clinical agents are exposed to contexts that can be wrong, and why today's safety checks miss it. Then the core idea, certify the input before the agent resends, then how it works, the 5 stages, then the evidence from my benchmark, and I will close with deployment, the honest limitations, and the takeaways. Let's start with the shift that created this problem. Clinical software has changed characters in the last couple of years. It used to advise the clinicians who stayed in the loop. Now it acts. Agents pull data from records, claims feeds, pharmacy systems, and device streams, and they write results back to the chart. Increasingly, they coordinate, so a single case is divided across several specialist agents. The important consequence is the one on the right in the red. The focus of the risk has moved. It is no longer a recommendation a clinician reviews and can catch. It is an action an agent takes directly on the context it assembled. And once the software acts, the correctness of the context stops being a convenience and becomes a safety property. So, how do we keep the system safe today? The field has largely settled on one answer shown on the left. You hand the model retrieved evidence, it generates a response. And then second check verifies that the response stays faithful to that evidence. RAG citation enforcement does this. Faithfulness judges do this and it is useful. But notice what it guards, the output. Here's the problem. On the right, and it's the crux of the whole talk. Faithful is not the same as correct. A response can match its context word for word and still be wrong for the patient because the context is a window stitched together from a medication list, a newer pharmacy fill, an intake note, a monitor feed, and a claim. None of the output side checks ever ask whether the assembled context is itself consistent, current, and authoritative. That is the gap. Let me make the concrete point here because it's easy to say in the abstract. An agent is managing anticoagulation, it assembles context. The medication list, the 14 days old information, says the patient is on the anticoagulant. A newer pharmacy fill, 2 days old, says the drug was discontinued. The agent reads both and acts. Now the output side, judge looks at the generated text, sees that it is faithful to the context it was handed, and passes the action. But the context is stale. The medication was stopped. The action is internally consistent and it is unsafe. You cannot catch this at the output because nothing about the output is unfaithful. The error is upstream in the input. That is exactly why ATTEST inspects the context before inference. So, here the idea in one sentence. ATTEST certifies the input context before any agent reasons over it. Concretely, that means 5 things. You will see them across the bottom of the slide and again through the rest of the talk. Score how authoritative each source is for that kind of fact. Score how fresh each fact is. Arbitrate when fragments conflict. Get the whole window on its weakest safety critical fact, and when confidence is too low to act, fetch the single most useful missing piece of the evidence. Let me unpack each of this in the subsequent slides. These 5 mechanisms are the contribution of the research paper, and together they turn a raw context window into certified one. First, a trust prior that depends on the source and the kind of fact together, not the source alone. Second, a freshness model where each fact decays at the rate that kind of fact actually goes stale. Third, a reliability weighted arbitration that reconciles conflicting fragments into posterior over the true value. Fourth, a window confidence set by the weakest safety critical fact, not an average. And fifth, a budgeted acquisition step that fetches the most informative missing fact. One scope note at the bottom, we certify structured and semi-structured facts, medication, labs, coded observations. Free text contradiction detection is out of scope, and it is in the future work. Before the mechanism, we need to have a vocabulary for what actually goes wrong, and we formalize it as 4 context defects. Staleness, a fragment that aged past its useful life. Source conflict, 2 fragments that disagree about the same entity. Provenance ambiguity, a weak source treated as the equal of a strong one. And a critical gap where a safety critical entity has thin combined evidence even when no single fragment looks obviously wrong. What I want you to notice is that a T line under each one. Every defect maps to a specific stage of the layer. That mapping is the backbone of the architecture. This is the whole system on one slide. So let me walk it left to right. Raw context fragments come in on the left from the EHR, pharmacy, clients, and device streams. They flow into ATTEST layer, which is the 5 stages in the middle. I will tell in the order. Conditional provenance, clinical half-life freshness, Bayesian conflict arbitration, the confidence envelope, and the triage with active fetch. Each stage consumes the scored fragments, the previous one produced, and add a richer annotation. The output on the right is what we call a clinical context certificate, a resolved, scored, and signed context. That certificate is what the agent fleet reasons over, and because it's signed and stored, other agents can reuse it, and any later action is auditable back to the exact context that drove it. Now let me open up the stages that do the real work. The first two stages are about scoring. Provenance first. The keyword is conditional. A source is not authoritative in general, only for certain kinds of act. A pharmacy dispensing record is the ground truth for what was dispensed, but it is a poor source for an active diagnosis. The problem list is exactly the reverse. So we store trust as the prior indexed by both source and data type, and that prior carries across cases as a clinical asset. Freshness is the second stage, and here the key idea is the clinical half-life. Different data ages at widely different rates. A documented allergy is effectively permanent. A point of care glucose reading is stale within hours. So each data types get its own half-life, and the equation on the right is just the exponential decay tuned to it. Reliability is the product of the two, authority times currency. So the fragment needs to be both trustworthy and current to carry weight. Stage 3 is where the conflicts get resolved. And this is the part a reviewer asked us to state in clinical terms, so let me be precise. When fragments disagree, ATTEST treats the correct patient fact as unknown and estimates it from the conflicting fragments using reliability weighted evidence. More authoritative and fresher sources contribute more to the estimate. The formula of the right is the posterior. Each candidate value gets the share of reliability mass behind it. The confidence is the mass on the winning value, and the entropy of the distribution is the uncertainty, which is the signal that later decides whether we need to go fetch more evidence. The payoff is that the stale entry loses to a fresher, more authoritative one on weight rather than being dumped into the window for the agent to sort out. And as you will see in the results, this beats both majority voting and naive recency selection. Stages 4 and 5 turn all that scoring into decision. Stages 4 is the confidence envelope, and it is deliberately conservative. The Windows confidence is the minimum confidence across the safety critical facts, not the average. Taking the minimum means a pile of solid facts can never hide one bad one. For a safety control, that's the right way to fail, closed rather than optimistic. So the stage 5 acts on it. When a safety critical fact sits below its threshold, the layer does not push ahead. It flags the fact, escalates to a person, or acquires more evidence. And when it acquires, it uses value of information. It buys the fetch that removes the most uncertainty per unit cost, capped by a budget, so that the certification never stalls a live workflow. Putting it together, the full procedure is just these 7 steps. Group fragments into entities, score reliability, detect conflicts and enumerate candidates, compute the posterior and its entropy, set the window confidence from the weakest fact, run the capped acquisition loop, and emit the signed certificate. The reason this is practical is on the right. The cost is near linear. F log F plus the budget term, because each fragment lands in exactly one posterior and the acquisition loop is bounded by the budget. So this is cheap enough to run inline on a real context window in front of the live agent. A pair question at this point is where the number comes from, the trust values and the half-lives. And the honest answer is that they are not constants of nature, so we treat them as configurable pairs. The table shows the defaults we used. Allergies persists for years and lives for EHR allergy record. Vitals are fresh for hours and come from device streams and so on. I want to be exact about the wording because it matters about reproducibility. These are illustrative defaults used to configure the benchmark. A deploying institution would turn them into its own governance policy, and because they are configurable, we don't just assume them, we stress test them. We will have that as part of our results. Now the evidence. What you are seeing here is the overall evidence that we have observed. And obviously when I was testing this, like I could able to see that the 108,000 plus safety critical entities across 8 seats with 42% carrying seeded conflict. Those conflicts are drawn from 4 realistic patterns on the left. And then like on the right, no certification, which is essentially a head count and an output jet, which is additionally blocks pure hallucination, but is blind to context defects. One caveat I will repeat later, this is a reproducible stress test of the mechanism, not yet steady on the live records. Here is the headline result, and it is it's the slide to remember. The unsafe action rate, the share of safety critical entities and the system acts on, all like shown as part of this. Next, do we actually need both the signals? The ablation says yes. Drop freshness and conflict resolution accuracy collapses from 85 to 33, and so both do real work freshness the most here, because so many of these conflicts addressed are like mentioned here. Weaker confidence lowers the unsafe rate only because the gate refuses more cases and routes them into escalation. 2 operational questions. So first, what does acquisition cost you? The curve on the left trade latency for autonomy with no fetch. We escalate about 23% of the safety critical cases. On fetch drops that to 14%. 2 fetches to 10%. A third barely moves it, so we report 2 fetches as the knee, which is about the quarter of a second of latency. A certifier that swung widely with a small change to a prior wouldn't be worth trusting. So this one doesn't. Let me be practical and very clear on this part. On deployment, because these context windows are already assembled over fire ATTEST slots in as a gateway on the context path, it is not a new system of record. A shared certificate stores lets many agents reuse one signed certificate. Okay, so the number depends on how the benchmark seed conflicts. A study on real de-identified records is the natural next step. So bring it together. Safety controls for clinical agents have guarded the output. The payoff in 3 numbers. Unsafe actions down to 6.1 from nearly 37%. The conflict resolution to 85%, where voting reaches 22% for about a quarter second of latency. And next steps are to push arbitration into free text, learn the priors from outcomes rather than seeding them, and validate on real records. That's all about ATTEST. Thank you.